that. So even if it's in a good neighborhood, doesn't mean it's a good deal. You got to understand the product that you're buying. Hello and welcome to Pillars of Wealth Creation, where we talk about creating financial success with a special focus on business and real estate. I'm your host, Todd Dexheimer. Now, let's get to it. Hello and welcome back to Pillars of Wealth Creation. I'm your host, Todd Dexheimer, and I've got Matt Brawner with me today. And Matt was back, man, it was a long time ago, 2019, episode 158. So check that episode out. But a lot has changed since then, Matt. So welcome back to the show.
Yeah, that was an interesting day for me because I still was owning and managing properties like duplexes on the deep east side. Like, this is an area you don't want to go. And I was so dumb that I was selling one of the duplexes, and I thought, I'm going to go tell the tenants that we're selling the property and they'll appreciate that I did this face to face. Well, they're a bunch of drug addicts and they were strung out, and they did not. And they chased me out of my own property that day. And then I had to come back to the office and get on a podcast with you. So I was like, I was all over the place because I had been running for my life out of my own property.
Is that the same property that you had, did you board it up or what? Was that this? You had a property?
No, that was a different one. That was one
same area though.
Same area. I mean, we could get into good landlord stories here. Like, right after we closed, squatters took over a unit, started doing horrible, awful things, like running prostitutes and drugs, and there's gunshots coming out of there. You know, I get city violations for everything under the sun, for having cracked trim on a parking garage. But I'm calling the city every day. I'm like, please, can you condemn the unit? Please come get these people out. I've had to pull back my staff. They're creating hell on earth. And the city's like, well, they're not really doing anything against the code. I'm like, are you kidding me? So
they're
over
shooting
3 months,
guns out of the property.
That's not against the code. They're like, is something wrong with the front door? You might be able to get them on that. No, the front door is fine. They were able to hide their guns behind it. But we ended up having to get it boarded up. I had to get escorted there by the cops. The guy came back. He was strung out. He went after the contractor, who's a buddy of mine. He passes me a knife, like right as the guy's coming to get us. He leaves, thankfully. And, I go home that night. It was a little bit late for dinner. My wife's like, "How was your day?" I was like, "Well, you know, it was a little bit more stressful than usual."
Jeez.
So managing properties is hard, and stay out of the hood.
Yeah, that's the hardest part, right? The hood, but the hood is so attractive, isn't it? Like, because the numbers look so good. On paper, they do.
On paper, they do. But then you also start subtracting numbers off the years of your life. Like, that's why I'm bald up here, is managing properties in the hood. Like,
yeah,
you learn.
There's so many, although I have made some pretty good money in the rough areas, but you have to go, is the juice really worth the squeeze? Like, did I really want to go through all that, right? Get thrown in the back of a squad car, like clean up crap, like human feces, like every time the tenant moves out, do I really want to re-renovate the unit that was already renovated? The best one was, Matt, where I had a property that in Cincinnati that rats were going through the city. Like, these are the city's rats. Like, they're going through the sewer system, but they're going up into my property and crawling out of the toilets. And the city's like, you got to take care of this problem. I'm like, I have to take care of this problem. Like, these are your rats. Like, these are not my rats.
Coming out of your sewer.
Right. Coming out of your sewer, coming up the freaking toilets. Like, my tenants are like going to the bathroom and like a rat comes up. Freaky. Like, that is scary. So I'm like, well, what do we do? Like, I don't know what to do here. We actually, like,
we condemned the building. We moved all the tenants out of there, put them into different units. Half of them weren't paying the rent anyway, so we just, they just they just went away. And then we capped the toilets. So like what else do? We threw a bunch of poison down the lines and capped the toilets and said, well, maybe we will change the rats' habits and they won't come through the toilets anymore. And so it sat vacant for like, I don't know, 3, 4 months while the toilets were capped, and we finally just reopened it back up and said, well, hopefully that worked. And it did, at least for the little bit of time. So we opened back up so we got everything 100% occupied besides that building, capped the toilets, did all that. And then we opened it back up, and then I got it occupied right away and then sold it. Oh my God, this stupid thing.
What you have to do, and we can kind of use this to dovetail into the market, but it's what's hard about like true like C-D buildings.
Yeah.
You can get them full, but in the blink of an eye, because these people live just transient lifestyles, right? So you can be full, maybe even collecting rent, and then you can wake up and they can all move out.
Yes.
It's so hard to build any consistency.
Yeah. I mean, that particular property, I had 18, it was just a 20 unit. So I had 18 out of 20 units completely occupied. And I was, the original business plan was like, this is in such a bad neighborhood, but I got it for a smoking deal. Well, again, on paper. So I'm going to do this. I'm going to renovate. I'm going to get these units occupied, and then I'm going to sell it. No, I got 18 out of 20 occupied. And I was like, this thing cash flows like crazy. Like, why would I sell this thing? This is a cash cow. So I held it. And then I went from 18 occupied down to like 8 occupied, and I had to re-renovate units the second and the third time. And then the rat issue, and then management issues, and, contractor issues. And all of a sudden, this thing is like just bleeding me. And finally, years later, after I realized what I had mistakenly done, I finally sold the thing and, made pennies basically on the building that I bought for almost free. Like, I almost got this thing for free. It's ridiculous. Still didn't make money. Well, barely made money.
Yeah, it seems like the strong in our business and those with the best asset types seem to outrun the rest of the pack. And Todd and I were at the Minnesota Real Estate Journal Mid-Year Apartment Summit, and this is a little bit of the conversation we were having there. And when I say the strong, I mean like the people who are well capitalized, who have the ability to invest strongly in property management. They frankly have it in house, and they have the wherewithal to pay top dollar for the best staff and to continue to invest in the property. And then those who buy really good assets, like things don't move up in tandem. You see the top end really take off. And, that's my candid view of the current state of the market. I'm stealing from a lot of other smart folks that I listen to, but I think in October of last year, when you saw the 10-year hit 5%, that was the bottom for everybody. But since that time, you've really seen kind of your B plus A assets in well-located markets really get a ton of attention. When they go to market, they're getting pre-COVID level of offers, or we'll call it the 21-22 level of offers. And you're seeing people there consistently perform well, especially if they had the ability, hey, we can get low leverage here. We can really cash flow nicely, even with a 10-year at 5%, right? Our investors are happy. But it's everyone else who's still stuck with some of the older vintage there. And you can still be super successful with older vintage because real estate's hyper local. But if you're not well capitalized, you're just not being caught up in the tide like you were in 21, 22.
Yeah. Well, that's the key with the older vintage, right? You have to be really well capitalized, and older vintage, you got to be careful because a lot of times the older vintage is in rough neighborhoods just because that's just how neighborhoods evolve, right? And so these are old, tired neighborhoods, and a lot of times that's where the older vintage is. Now, if you're in a older vintage property and you look at the Twin Cities in any market, right? But there's buildings that are built back in the early 1900s, mid 1900s that are in great locations. I mean, we've got a city that, anybody in the Twin Cities knows, Edina, that has a lot of, 60s, 50s, 60s, and 70s product. Those are older vintage, but in a fantastic neighborhood. But again, those can suck you dry really quickly if you're not well capitalized on something like that. So even if it's in a good neighborhood, doesn't mean it's a good deal. You got to understand the product that you're buying. Matt, you are, so for the listeners, Matt is my partner in Endurance Capital. I don't think I introduced you as that. 2019, we were just starting to kind of partner on stuff together. And so that was the last time you were on this podcast. So it was quite a while ago. I don't know why. I think, well, you have done a couple episodes, but without me, maybe with Drew. So anyway, so Matt is going to be joining me, once a month or so, and just adding some color to our Wednesday episodes. So I want to talk about what you do for our business, which a big portion of what you do is seeing a lot of the acquisition sides and the operation sides, but seeing a lot of the acquisition side, seeing the product that's out there, what's going on. So just give us a short, I guess, intro to what you look at, and then we'll dive into kind of some details.
Absolutely. Well, glad I could finally make it back on the podcast here with you. As Todd said, focus on acquisitions, work with our director of acquisitions, Zach Heiding. And we spend time in our core markets. We are really focused on the Midwest here. We just believe that it's seen good predictability. We don't get the high highs, but we've also avoided the low lows. So these are still growing markets, but we haven't seen the overwhelming supply wave that your Sunbelt areas have. So that's why right now we are still seeing rent growth, and we're willing to underwrite to that as well. We really like kind of your central Midwest. So think Lexington, Louisville, Columbus. We've had multiple investments go full cycle. We've just built up a lot of operational knowledge there. And then we're really focused on our own backyard here in the Twin Cities, where we have the opportunity to integrate management. And I think that's pretty telling of where the market's at right now. And that's how we look at deals, because you're coming out of a time period where interest rates are super low. There's almost euphoria around multifamily. And there are a lot of people who made money that really didn't have an appreciation for what was happening on the ground. And so some of those folks have turned around 3 years later and said, my expenses are what on the property level, just because of how easy expense creep can be. And so as we look at opportunities now, it's heavily focused. We're always looking for cash flow, but even more so when you look at the current interest rate environment, like, do we have the ability as we stress test a deal to know that we can still cash flow here? Do we have a lending partner? We're really focused, every deal is a little bit different, but ideally focused on an agency execution. So that means Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, just because you create certainty with your debt. That's the largest part of your capital structure. And then where can we build out density? So as we look at the markets, how can we continue to build around those where we already have knowledge and had deals go full cycle?
Yeah. Yeah. I think we looked at recently a lot of the market data and year over year rent growth in pretty much all the markets we're in the Midwest are 3 to 5%. I think Matt Mullins, who was on one of the panels with Maxfield, I think he said Twin Cities is about 3%, and that matches up with the data that we see. But was it Louisville, Kentucky was at 5.4%. So yeah, that's kind of exciting that we're actually seeing still really solid rent growth. Probably just a big part of that is that we never saw this huge acceleration either. Like, we didn't see the Austin, Texas 30% year over year rent growth, Phoenix, whatever. We didn't see that. And now they're paying the price. They're seeing, negative 6% rent growth. So we're not seeing that. Matt, you mentioned the debt. You mentioned the risk of the debt and the agency and that's something that we were not as thoughtful maybe of, or we were willing to go with, kind of some flexible interest rate debt. Talk about the debt and the reason why we're more focused on the type of debt we're focused on.
Sure. Like a lot of folks, there's a couple of deals where we took on some floating rate short-term debt. And we've got a couple of those deals that I think are going to be just fine. And we've got some other deals that are all hands on deck, not necessarily because we aren't hitting our pro forma targets, but because you got to remember that the debt is going to be structured in a very specific way. So if it's short term, hey, it's been 2 to 3 years, we want out of this. So you are aggressively being pushed to look for other options. And real estate is a dynamic business. It's basic, but renting out units for the rent you want, being able to collect it, being able to steward properties, that's something that requires a lot of attention day in and day out. And so when you've got volatility on the largest part of your capital stack, it's distracting and it takes away from property operations as well. And so what makes multifamily unique, and we've invested in other commercial assets and had those do quite well, but it's Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac that keep us coming back to multifamily because they provide constant liquidity, right? Even as interest rates have shot up, you've seen a lot of the, we'll call them bridge lenders, people that do short-term lending. Those folks have backed away to the sidelines because nothing pencils for them. But Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac are almost obligated because they're backed by the full faith and credit of the US government to continue lending. So if you have properties that are stabilized and can be purchased with agency debt, then you always have an exit there. And we like it because it creates consistency. My interest rate is fixed, and because you have a lender that's looking, the shortest term, you could get maybe some floaters. Those aren't too popular right now, but even the shortest term agency loan is a 5-year loan. Well, okay, now I know that I've got 5 years to ride out any market cycles that come. 5 years ago, 2019 was a different world. So yeah, you can get some short terms, ups and downs, but if I know my debt is the biggest part of my capital stack, I want to make sure that I have consistency there so that I'm de-risking the asset. And that's kind of how we look at things, right? Like, we're not going to go purchase assets just if we can break even and hope that things appreciate. But we're going to stress test it and say, well, what if we can't get any type of rental increases? And value add isn't just about rental increases. Value add can be maybe putting on better debt. Value add can be a better expense structure. That's one of the reasons we're excited to continue to integrate our property management company in the Twin Cities, because we can approach and operate these properties fundamentally differently. Well, what if I can't execute on those? Where does that leave me? And so if I know my debt's consistent and I'm really stress testing, I'm like, look, I can still pay down principal, I can still push out distributions. Maybe they're not distributions I want. Well, then that's really appealing to me. So you never say never. Maybe there's other projects that come along where we could look at bridge debt, but right now, agency financing is how we want to put together our capital stack.
Yeah. Well, I think it's well said. Like, look, it just adds another layer of risk onto the deal. And so is that a risk you're willing to take on? Does it match with the deal and with the, the opportunity? You got to make sure it actually matches, and it matches your risk appetite. And there's a lot of volatility right now. So I think not having a floating rate debt is a pretty nice product. It's funny because I saw this meme, I think the other day, and it was like these couple of guys that were like sitting drinking, Mai Tais or whatever, and they're watching houses on fire. And it just said something about like, feels good to have long-term fixed rate debt when everybody else has floating. And I'm like, oh, there you go. But when we look at our portfolio, the properties we sleep extremely well at night on all have fixed rate debt. And it's not necessarily all agency, but the agency definitely feels good. But even like our commercial properties, we've got term on that, and it's fixed and it feels good. And so those are properties that feel really good. And anytime you have a floating rate debt, you have a timeline. And so, you know, eventually you're going to have to go back to the market and get whatever market rates are. So,
Yep.
Matt, so let's talk about what you're seeing in the market. You guys, you work a lot with Zach, who is our director of acquisitions, as you mentioned, and Zach's underwriting a pile of deals right now. And so it's exciting to be able to see a lot of deals, but what are you seeing as far as these deals that come to us and you know, like what's going on with those deals?
Sure. So I would comment broadly that we have seen a dramatic increase in transactions from 2023, which is positive. You are seeing distress, particularly with older properties, tick up. It's by no means the wave of distress that we've been fearing would come, and maybe that still will. But in fairness, it has pushed up there. And then I think the other pieces that have really contributed to it is kind of, I would say threefold. Year one, you have groups that will own properties for fixed amount of times, or you have an owner that has just owned for 10 plus years. Sometimes they've been generational. Like, look, I just don't want to do this anymore. And the same
Yep.
reason people buy and sell houses in any phase, like divorce or anything, death along those ways, well, that applies to commercial properties too, and that's happening. Then you also have people who've said, look, I have not been able, or I cannot push out or refinance any further. So I'm not necessarily being forced to sell. I'm not foreclosed on, but I'm saying right now is my greatest opportunity to move. And they have lenders who are nodding alongside them saying, yes, that's a really good idea, that you should sell
Yeah, I
there.
mean, it makes a lot of
And
sense if you've held a property for a long time and you're sitting here going, well, even if you had long-term fixed rate debt, but you had long-term fixed rate debt, and now the term is up and you're going, well, what do I do? Do I sell? Do I keep? If I keep, I got to refinance. I got to refinance at today's rates. Does that really make sense? No, let me take some chips off the table. We're going to sell this and we're going to buy another property at a good, basis as well. So, or retire and sail off into the sunset, whatever you're doing. So it's not necessarily a
yeah,
distress situation. Sometimes it's just look at, I know I'm getting 25% haircut, but it makes sense.
yep. I think you'd see, in terms of what you're seeing in the market, people are viewing properties dramatically differently based on the age and vintage. And you can still have good deals that are in the 60s, especially if they're well located there. But I would say, as people look at that specific type, man, you've got a cash flow right away. And it's got to be meaningful cash flow. It can't be 2 to 3%. You're looking at, hey, how do I hit out of the gate, man, 6, 7, even 8% here if I'm looking at that older vintage, and that's the lens that we take as well. Something newer is getting a ton of interest right now. And when I say newer, think anything 1990s and older. If you've got a 9-foot ceiling, maybe townhome product, where you can execute a light value add and you can get an agency loan, kind of the flavor of the day for agency lending is 5 years, 65% loan to value. People like the 5-year option because it enables you a flexible exit, or the most flexible exit with agency lenders. That type of stuff that hits the market, that gets, I'm not going to say, 2021 pricing, but it gets 2021 level of interest right now. So we are still active, still chasing. We've gotten closer recently, and we can dive into some of the things there. Some of the, specifically as we look at managing some things in house, we just have a different expense structure there. With some of the newer stuff, you don't have to underwrite to some of the, oh my goodness, increases in insurance premiums that we've seen on some of the older vintage there too. If stuff is trading below property tax value, it's not a slam dunk. It doesn't always happen, but you can then start to write in some decreases, in property taxes as well.
Yeah.
So that's kind of what we see in terms of deals that we like. We still like a value add opportunity, not seen as much as the huge repositions, just because of the debt for that is tougher to come by.
Yeah. And as far as the property taxes goes, know your market really well, right? Understand not only your state, but understand your county and how they look at sale transactions and underwrite and especially if you're buying something that's distressed, because very often if you're buying something that they consider a distressed asset, they don't consider that a market sale. And so they're not going to look at that and say, oh yeah, your property taxes are going to go down 35, 45% because you bought this distressed asset. So you got to be careful, especially if you're buying distressed assets. Don't be too crazy with your underwriting, and just understand what the market does. Best thing to do, Matt, what we consult with people that do this for a living, right?
Yeah, there are property tax attorneys who their whole business is that they will appeal your property tax valuation. Now they get a commission if they're successful, but if you can build a relationship with them, and this is why you can find value in real estate, because every set of property taxes is specific, honestly, to the county. It can be even in the same state. So finding someone who can understand that and knows how the property tax assessor for that county, how an individual views things, can tell you, look, here's where I think we can appeal. Here's what I think you can reasonably expect. Creates a ton of value, can help create opportunities, but also creates a ton of protection.
Yeah. Matt, what are like 2 or 3 takeaways from today's apartment summit that you got?
I would say one is that you are seeing transaction volume turnaround. And so that has people hopeful and excited for what's to come this year. I would say number 2 is something that I already touched on there, which is that we are seeing a bifurcation in the market. So still can have good deals from the 60s and 70s, but those are being looked at through a different return lens than your deals from the 90s and 2000s. And then number 3 would be the importance of operations and management. And that may sound like a duh, but that's become really important, and that's become really hard, right? You've got to pay people more. It's become harder to operate because of some things that were intended for renter protection, had some unintended consequences in terms of how you collect, how you unfortunately have to evict sometimes. And so having a manager that's intimately familiar with your market and has the staffing capabilities to steward and serve your property is incredibly important.
Yeah, and staff's hard to come by, and you got to pay good money for good staff. I mean, we've got a property that's really well located, and we just seem to have staff that turns over constantly on that property. And it's tough on every time we're like, hey, look at, we're at 95% occupancy, all of a sudden, or 98, whatever, all of a sudden that staff member leaves, and now we go back down and slide down to the low 90s, high 80s, and then we do it all over again. And so it's tough. You've got to understand that staff is really tough to come by. You got to pay really good rates and do a really good job managing those staff. But operations are definitely huge. I found it was interesting. They were talking about, just basically advertising to prospective tenants. And they're talking about TikTok being a big one, YouTube Shorts being a big one. So basically, and I thought, well, what a great, if you can hire somebody to come into your property and they can do video, and they can go into these units and they can video and take pictures of residents doing activities, using some of your amenities, things like that. They can talk to, even do an interview with. How cool would that be? Now you can slice that up and make a ton of TikTok videos and YouTube Shorts and Instagram Reels and stuff like that. And you can use that for marketing. But I think the biggest point wasn't necessarily about that, but you got to be creative and you got to start thinking outside the box. Your residents aren't coming because they drove by your property and then they, knock on the door and say, hey, I want to rent here, or even call you. Like, that's one of the last things they do is pick up the phone. What did they say, Matt? It takes 11, 12 touches is for the average, something like that?
To sign a lease, and it's taken longer to run background checks. And yeah, the phrase during that particular panel that came to mind to me was, the more things change, the more they say the same. Like, because you are right, like you're marketing in drastically different ways. You got to be able to think on your feet to be able to do that, right? You're not just posting out to Craigslist like I was able to when I got started. But at the same time, when people get beyond the TikTok ad, they want to come to a person, right? And it's that person's ability to speak to them and help assure them that they're going to be cared for at the property. And it was a great line. People still want to be by people. And if something's broken in somebody's unit, they want it fixed. If they call the office, they want a person to answer. So we got to be dynamic in how we market, but people still want people on the other end of the line to help them feel good about where they live.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah. It's still a person business. You can't just think technology is going to completely take over. As much as you might want it to, it's still a person business, and people want to feel appreciated. They want their phone calls answered. They want their maintenance taken care of. They still want those things done. So, man, anything else you want to unpack from the summit today?
No, I think we covered it, but I'm super excited to be able to join you here on Wednesdays and keep chatting about what we're seeing in the market.
Awesome, man. Well, appreciate you joining us, and listeners, you have a fantastic rest of the day. Make every day Saturday.
Hey, thanks so much for listening. I appreciate you being a loyal listener. I would love to have you go on to our Facebook page and subscribe, give us a thumbs up, go on to iTunes or wherever you listen and give us a rating and review. Don't forget to subscribe. Your rating and review just helps us push this out to more and more people and continue to grow our audience and hopefully positively affect a ton of people out there that really need this and want this. So the other thing I've got for you is a free ebook on my website. So go on to venturedproperties.com, and download our free ebook on real estate and on syndication. And I've got some data points in there, some really good stuff for you. So I'd love to have you take a look at that. It's free. I'm not expecting anything from it. And also, look, if you want some help in multifamily, want some help learning, growing, getting your business off the ground, I would love to talk to you about what it would look like to work with me potentially and see if that's a good fit. So you can go to coachwithdex.com and check that out, and we can definitely have a call. Thanks a lot for listening. You make it a fantastic rest of the day. I'll catch you on the next episode.